and they start talking about we're going to escape. And he's like, look, I was a scuba diver in the Navy. Y'all don't stand a chance with these tides. They're too rough. The water's too cold. And at Alcatraz, the one benefit they were given was hot showers. Other prisons, you might have to take a cold shower, but not Alcatraz, because they didn't want them to get acclimated to cold water. So he's sitting there telling them, look, if you do this, you're going to have to leave on this side of the island at this time of day when the tide is in this predicament, because it'll actually push you toward Angel Island, and that's going to be your best benefit. So listen, Matt, it's the only case in history that I can find where a serial killer becomes a true victim of crime, and then he reaches out to law enforcement for help, because the detective that originally arrested him for his murders, he asked when she was still missing, can you find her? He said, you caught me after 25 years. Can you find my daughter?
What?
Exactly.
Like, you couldn't even come up with it. Like, this sounds so insane that it's almost fake.
We're at lunch one day and he looks at me and he says, hey, do you mind if I give your kids some advice? And I said, of course not, please. So he looks at my daughter who's 10 and he says, never.
Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I am here with Sheryl McCollum. She goes by Mac. She's in law enforcement. She was on CSI Atlanta. She is involved in cold cases, and we're going to talk about some cold cases and and basically her background. So check out the interview. Where were you born?
I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Grew up in Fulton County my entire life, even went to college in downtown Atlanta at Georgia State. Still work in Fulton County. So I'm right here, native.
And what got you interested in law enforcement? Wait a minute. Was it your mom?
Yes.
Okay.
No, but no doubt. My mother could tell a story that would just stop you dead in your tracks. And she was a tremendous, gifted storyteller, and she knew a ton of history. She was a history teacher. So she would craft it in a way that you would just be on the edge of your seat. Well, we used to take long car trips, and when you would get outside Atlanta, about an hour and a half, the radio wouldn't work any longer. Well, she had 5 girls to entertain. So she would usually start somewhere like, what this road reminds me of? Well, then we would know, here it comes. And the first story that I remember being captivated by was Bonnie and Clyde. And it just went from there. And so then she would tell us stories about John Dillinger and Al Capone and Babyface Nelson. And it just never stopped being interesting to me. So from the age of 4 on, it was always, what can I learn about? What can I read about? Who can I go meet? What can I go see? And when I was 8, they took me to see the death car. And then when I was 12, they took me to Alcatraz. So it just never left me.
Yeah. What did Bonnie and Clyde, was it 18 months or something? They're 16 months. They're crying. It seems like it was, if you hear all the stories and you think, oh, it must be just years and years, but it wasn't that long.
It was not that long. Nope.
I wonder what the real story is. Because there are like those reports and the documentaries that talk about how, was it, who was the FBI director then? Hoover, right? Like he was, kind of trying to manipulate the press, what was happening, what wasn't happening. And then it was like, okay, they were gunning down the officers, or wait, maybe the officers shot at them first, or, like, I don't know. But it's kind of like I said earlier, before we even started, about the con man guy that I watched that movie about. It was a movie that was based on true events. It was a real story, and I talked to the guy that wrote the story and did all the investigating, and the guy's on the FBI's most wanted list. Like, he was a con man. He was always running little scams and things, and then suddenly he ended up just out of the blue. He robbed a courier and he shot and killed him, and it was so senseless that it just didn't, it made no sense at all. It was totally out of character. So
Right.
you just never know. Like, you think like Bonnie and Clyde, like they're robbing banks, but they don't really want to hurt anybody. But then again, that doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily also killing people. Maybe they did. Who knows?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I need to introduce you to Raylene Linder and Buddy Barra. They are family members of Bonnie and Clyde, and they can tell you firsthand what they know. Raylene knew everybody involved. And their story is, I don't even know how to tell you how captivating. And it's a good, again, to me, if you look at the history of crime, you can see the history of America. And when you talk about somebody like J. Edgar Hoover, he was a marketer. He was brilliant. When he came up with, the most wanted, public enemy number one, that's genius. Because now you've got everybody bought in to getting this person. So if in fact, John Dillinger is gunned down on the street, you've already told everybody he's the most violent person there is. So nobody questions anything about it. So I mean, to me, he did an unbelievable job in that regard. But there's always two sides. So I think, if you got a chance to talk to Raylene, you would just adore her.
Right. I mean, there's so many underhanded things that, Hoover was involved in that, there was a Nazi plot where they dropped off these saboteurs, and one of the Germans went straight to the FBI and said, "Hey, listen, this is what's going on. Like, we landed, there's like six of us. We're supposed to blow this stuff up. I don't want to be involved." And they go and they arrest all of them, including the guy that went to them. And they try them, and they all get like the electric chair. And just before one of the main guy that had gone and turned them in, and keep in mind, they didn't even want to believe him. He had to show up with a bunch of counterfeit money. He pulled out like $30,000 in counterfeit U.S. bills and said, "Look, they gave us this money to use. It's counterfeit." And they were like, "What the hell?" So that made them think, "Oh, this has got to be real."
Yeah.
It turns out like the president commuted the guy's sentence to life, but Hoover had pitched it as, "We discovered this plot, we arrested these guys," and then it ends up getting these guys the death penalty, and never says this guy came forward. He was the reason, and he's ready to execute him too. What a great way to keep him quiet.
Yeah.
So, there's so many little underhanded things like that about Hoover that, so it's, I don't know. It's the same thing with like, the Bonnie and Clyde thing, like where they definitely murdered some people, but I wonder how it came about.
And they definitely robbed some banks, but did they rob all the ones that they were, pinned for?
Right.
I mean, there was no better time basically to rob your own bank and blame it on them.
Right.
Think about it.
Or how much was actually taken,
Exactly.
They got $500, but they got $200.
Right.
So the Alcatraz thing, we had talked about the Alcatraz, that you had met one of the guys that was in Alcatraz, a bank robber.
Yes. Robert Chevron, inmate 1355, honey.
How did you get connected with him?
I got connected because, again, I'm a history buff when it comes to crime. And, sometimes a story will just resonate with me. Well, the way he robbed banks, his getaway vehicle was the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Greatest getaway vehicle ever. It's got to be. I mean, that beats a Model T. That beats an airplane. I mean, come on. Right?
Right.
So the way he would, commit these crimes, he would stash civilian clothes in a locker at the bus station when they docked the first time. When they came...
in the Navy.
Because he was in the Navy.
Right.
So when they came around the second time, he would go to the bus station, change out of his uniform into civilian clothes, walk down the street, rob the bank, walk back, change back into his uniform, and literally walk back on the ship. Well, anybody walking in downtown San Francisco or wherever he was, they're not going to look at a naval man twice. So even if they've gotten some alarm call, they're not going to look at him. And that's not how, the witnesses are going to say he was dressed anyway. And by the time they're really investigating the case, that literally that ship has sailed and he's in another port. And it was just such a brilliant yet elementary type, scam that I thought, I got to meet this guy. And then from our first meeting, we just became friends. And he was funny. He was smart. He would openly tell you different things. And he put a lot of things in perspective. And the first time I got to meet him in person, I got up on the porch and I knocked on the door, and he's in the back of the house and says, come on in. And so I was joking with him that, hey, you're not real security conscious, being funny. And he went, listen, the minute I walked out of Alcatraz, I told myself I will never be behind a locked door again. And I thought, you know what? I get it. I love that. So, you learn from anybody. So I can learn from a fantastic police commissioner, and I can learn from an ex-criminal. They all have an expertise to share that you can use for the greater good. And he's just one of those people that I just connected with on a lot of levels. And he was a family person. He was super devoted to his family. And in a full circle moment, again, when I was 12, my parents took me to Alcatraz. Then I befriended Robert. And then his daughter invited me to participate in his memorial service on Alcatraz, which was an experience. Oh my gosh. I can't even tell you. It was overwhelming to see the devotion of his daughter and then the respect from the Rangers. It was really unbelievable. And we had Michael Esslinger, who's an expert in Alcatraz. He's written tons of books. He was basically our private guide along with the Rangers. So we got to go places the general public doesn't ever get to go. So it was awesome.
And you were saying that his daughter released his ashes underneath the cell?
Yes. Under his cell window. Yes. So he wanted her to, stand there literally under his, prison cell and, release his ashes so he could get off that island one more time. And if you knew him, that's part of his humor. And it's also part of, for him, it was just this, I'm going to be free. And it was more of that than, anything. So it was touching. It was interesting for historical purposes. Again, if you look at America, you can track America through crime. The American mafia, you can take it all the way through the way people rob banks, the way, shootings happen, the way murders happen, especially some of the, big time famous things that we all know. But Alcatraz is pinnacle to me.
When you mention him dressing up in, it's funny because it's kind of like the opposite of the Thomas Crown affair, where he actually gets into a uniform that everybody sees, that everybody recognizes, but it's certainly not what the police have been told to look for.
Exactly.
So I was locked up with a guy named Anthony Curcio, who had robbed and done a lot of research, really kind of figured this out. He, of course, he watched the Wells Fargo truck show up at a Bank of America, drop off the money. He knew somebody that actually worked there, that he, never, wouldn't, they knew something was wrong because it was a drop of $350,000 or $290,000. It was an excessive amount of money.
Yeah.
For those types of drops. And he watched them, knew the schedule. He had an outfit, right? He had the face mask. The guys that go around and they pick up trash.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a face mask, that little dust mask. He had an orange, the little reflecting thing that you wear.
The vest,
The vest. He had the little, we call them Cadillacs in prison. The long thing so you don't have to bend over, so you pick up and the little scooper thing, you put it in. And blue jeans and a white shirt. And that was his kind of he would dress up like that and wander around while he watched the schedule of when these guys would come and go. And then he would take his stuff and roll it up and stick it in the bushes and then leave and then come back and keep watching him. So he knew the schedule of the deliveries. And he went out and he got bear mace, and he actually sprayed himself with the bear mace to see, it's like, it's mace,
Sure.
just to see if, how bad is this going to decapacitate this guy? Because he said, I didn't want to use a gun. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to hurt him, and I didn't want to be charged with the gun if something went wrong. I didn't want them to say, hey, you had a gun.
Using forgeries and bogus identities, Matthew B. Cox, one of the most ingenious con men in history, built America's biggest banks out of millions. Despite numerous encounters with bank security, state, and federal authorities, Cox narrowly, and quite luckily, avoided capture for years. Eventually, he topped the U.S. Secret Service's most wanted list and led the U.S. Marshals, FBI, and Secret Service on a 3-year chase, while jet-setting around the world with his attractive female accomplices. Cox has been declared one of the most prolific mortgage fraud con artists of all time by CNBC's American Greed. Bloomberg Businessweek called him the mortgage industry's worst nightmare, while Dateline NBC described Cox as a gifted forger and silver-tongued liar. Playboy magazine proclaimed his scam was real estate fraud, and he was the best. Shark in the Housing Pool is Cox's exhilarating first-person account of his stranger-than-fiction story. Available now on Amazon and Audible.
And then this is where it just became, it's like, okay, all of that's like, oh, okay. And then, have you ever heard this story?
No.
Okay. And then he put an ad in Craigslist for the Clean Up Seattle Foundation. And they were paying $22 an hour for full-time employment. And it started on whatever it was, Monday, and 20-something people applied. He sent them all a list saying, that's fine, you have to show up at, 5 of them showed up at one area, 5 showed up at another, 5 showed up at another, 5 at another. And he said, you have to show up with your Cadillac, with your vest. He sent them a link on where they could buy it, with the face mask, everything. Wear blue jeans and a long sleeve shirt. And he said, that's basically your outfit. So you have to buy the stuff first, show up there that day at this time be there between 9 and 9:30, because that's when the truck arrived. And he showed up too.
Wow.
So he said, guys are walking around. They're like, man, what should we do? He said, some of the guys are actually walking like a block away, picking up trash already.
Yeah.
Like they're already picking up trash. And they were told, start working. Your supervisor will be there between 9 and 9:30. He said, I just did the same thing. I just kind of hung out near the parking lot, and then I saw the truck. And he said, yeah, I saw the truck. And he said, as soon as I saw the truck, and the guy, he said, it was like 3 quick steps from the alleyway, boom, 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 hit him with the mace. The guy dropped the bag, screamed. He grabbed the bag and took off running. He ran through a wooded area, and he had an inner tube in a canal. And he said, I just grabbed the inner tube, jumped on the inner tube, and the inner tube took him down. He said, just glided, because in Seattle, they're kind of like little islands. They have the road get closed off. He said they immediately closed the bridges. So they closed the bridges, so nothing but police could come in. He said he jumped off the inner tube, ran up the street to a title company, because he also was a real estate agent, walked in the front door. He said, I stripped off everything, walked in the front door. And she said, he goes, listen, as soon as I walked in, I was standing there. I said, hey, I need a copy of my closing statement from last week or from 2 weeks ago or whatever. They were like, oh, okay. And he said, do you hear that? And they were like, what? And he said, just then you started to hear the woo. He goes, it's sirens or something. Wonder what happened. And they were like, yeah, I don't know. They were like, oh, yeah, I do. I hear it. It's just so he said, so I knew if I ever needed an alibi, I could say, I was in that thing when I heard the sirens.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Didn't live too far from the place. Anyway, So yeah, they searched for him and searched for him and searched for him. And he's one of those guys that whenever people talk to me and say, do you ever think about doing anything again? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, well, what would be the perfect crime? I'm like, well, I can think of lots of perfect crimes. They're like, well, then why don't you do something? I'm like, because I can't think of the fly in the ointment. And that's what gets you messed up.
Got you. Yep.
Plan out some great, great crimes where you've never seen me. I haven't done anything. I was nowhere near it. You've got drop phones and you're using different computers and you never have to go in the place. You never have to do anything. But I'm telling you, there's always that thing you cannot think of. And in his case, when he took off running, he'd never been arrested. He took his mask and he threw his mask down. He said, I didn't mean to. I was just running. He said, I thought I had kept it with me and it just fell out, but I was running so fast I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, the thing is, nobody was chasing him. But he was gone. Like, I mean, literally before the phone call really went out, he was already on the inner tube.
Wow.
So he dropped his mask. He said, no big deal. They got my DNA. Doesn't matter. I've never been arrested. And that mask could have come from any place, anywhere. Wasn't too worried about it. And he said, so, and they've got nothing. Well, the FBI came and they talked to everybody. And keep in mind, the police show up, they start arresting these guys walking around they're handcuffing all these guys. There's 20 of them walking around going, what's going on? Hey, get on the ground. Ah.
Yeah.
So, but not him. They got a lot of suspects. So he said what ended up happening in that case was the FBI, they talked to everybody and they were looking through all the reports that came in because people start calling in. It might be my neighbor, might be this person. I talked to my buddy Joe down at the bar. He said this. He said they went through it all, nothing. He said they went through it a second time when they came up empty and they saw a report of a guy, a homeless guy had walked up to a city worker who was working on like the sewer system and said, I know who robbed that bank. And they're like, and the guy said, what? And he said, the guy was yelling and screaming. He had a little dog. He said he sounded crazy. I said, man, all right, get out of here. He was with the guy. He goes, he did make a report. The guy working on this for the city made a little report. Hey, this guy came up to me, said he knows it, but didn't want to talk to the police or something along those lines. Okay. He goes, well, let's go try and find that guy. He said they grabbed a bunch of hamburgers. They went down where the homeless are in Seattle and said, hey, do you guys know somebody with a little dog and a beard? They said, oh, you're talking about Bobby. Bobby lives in a bus in the woods. They go there, they pull up, they're walking towards the bus. Bobby walks out and says, man, I've been waiting months for you guys to show up. Is this about the bank robbery? And they said, yeah. Do you know who the guy is? He's like, well, I don't know his name, but I got his license tag.
Oh my God.
How he had come. He said, oh yeah, he came like every other day.
Right.
Watched the thing. And he would roll up his clothes and his mask. And I got his tag number. Because Anthony never even thought about the guy that was constantly walking around and lived in the woods.
It's what you said. The fly in the ointment.
How can you account for that?
Right.
And that's my problem. I'm like, look, you plan out this perfect crime and you did something you simply cannot account for, and you end up you have to do 20 years. So you think, look, I'm brilliant, I'm smart, I did everything correctly. You can do everything correctly. One person, somebody else makes a mistake, or somebody else happens to see something you couldn't account for.
Yeah.
My whole thing came unglued, my scam, because a girl I was working with went into the title company with an ID that had her picture on it, signed for a mortgage, and the person that the closing agent, the title agent, looked at her ID and said, this doesn't look like you. And she said, what do you mean? That's me. Mm-hmm. She said, no, something's off. This isn't you. Another title agent came in, looked at the picture and said, that's her. And she goes, no, something's wrong. I don't think this is you. I'm going to make some phone calls. I'll let you know. Took a good picture of her, put it on there, blew it up, made a good picture of the ID, gave her ID back. She left. How am I supposed to account for the fact that title person was wrong?
Right.
She made a mistake that unraveled my whole thing. So anyway, it's like we were talking about the on Alcatraz about the guys that had escaped, and you had said that the bank robber, I forget his name,
Robert,
that we said Robert had actually known them, sat down at the table with them.
Yes. So they were assigned to the same dinner table. So there's Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. They're all there with him. And they start talking about, we're going to escape. And he's like, look, I was a scuba diver in the Navy. Y'all don't stand a chance with these tides. They're too rough. The water's too cold. And at Alcatraz, the one benefit they were given was hot showers. Other prisons, you might have to take a cold shower, but not Alcatraz, because they didn't want them to get acclimated to cold water. So he's sitting there telling them, look, if you do this, you're going to have to leave on this side of the island at this time of day when the tide is in this, predicament, because it'll actually push you toward Angel Island, and that's going to be your best benefit. So what Robert did, part of his job was to go down to the lower end where they have one little guard shack right near the water, and he emptied the trash can. Well, the guard there was not supposed to bring in a newspaper. That was against the rules, but he did, and he would throw it away in that garbage can. Well, the San Francisco Chronicle published tide tables. So Robert would memorize them real quick, go back to his cell, write some things down so that he got the rhythm and the pattern so that he could best tell them, this is what you're going to need to do. You're going to try to leave during this time. This is your best shot. So he was instrumental in helping them understand the best way to go about it, which was crazy to me. Because again, as a 8-year-old and then a 12-year-old and then now thinking, I've actually talked to somebody, I've befriended somebody that had some small part into this escape. It was awesome for me. I mean, not just as a criminologist, but just anybody. I mean, that's a fascinating story, And then he told me that the Birdman of Alcatraz was involved as well, that he taught them Spanish because their goal was to get to South America and they wanted to blend in as best they could, and knowing the language would only help that. So, I mean, he was just an incredible person. A wealth of knowledge. He was funny. He was open. We had a great friendship.
Do you think that they made it? What do you think?
The 12-year-old me, yes, I think they made it. Sometimes when I'm driving in my car and, I start thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, if they had it planned out like I believe they did, and, maybe a boat picked them up, because there's rumors that a lot of the fishing vessels would, toss out liquor and other things to get caught in the rocks for the inmates to find. So, part of me wants to believe that that's why the raft was discarded, because they were pulled up onto a boat. Logically, is the water too cold and too rough and too shark infested? Yeah. I mean, most likely. But then you're like, hey, but the family got that one Christmas card and the expert said, yes, the writing matched. And then you had the photograph. And again, the experts said that, yeah, that looks like them. So, there's some evidence that they did make it. There's some evidence, obviously, that they didn't. You made a great point when you and I were talking privately that it's very difficult for career criminals, even if they make it to South America, to never have another issue, to never commit another crime, especially if you get there and you have no money.
Right.
So they would have had to do something. So did they have plastic surgery? Did they go straight? I don't know. If they in fact made it.
Can you
but
imagine
again, it's
surgery back then?
Oh, sure.
Oh, it was rough though.
Oh, it would be rough and it would be horrible, but you wouldn't look the same. So I guess that would be the purpose.
Yeah, very, very. I'd say unlikely that they went straight, but who knows? Or who knows? Like we were saying earlier, who knows with identification? Like they could have been arrested 3 states over for robbing 5 banks and just giving them a different name. It's not like there was a AFIS. They weren't going to pull up their fingerprints. I mean, they could print them, but the likelihood that they were going to compare them to these guys and they were going,
Sure.
So especially back then, if you had any kind of history, if your identity wasn't in question, then they really didn't question. Like if they lived in the county for 2 years or assumed someone's name or something, or they may have just been like, oh yeah, see, you live in New York, you moved here 2 years ago, he robbed 3 banks. Yeah, throw him in jail. He does 5 years and gets out. Who knows?
Well, Robert Shabline told me that his goal when he was still in Alcatraz, before he was released, he wanted the prints on the bottom of his toes to be put on his fingers.
I don't know how that would work, but.
Well, I mean, he had a doctor supposedly said that, yeah, he could take the top and then, put them on, and then his fingerprints would be completely different. And you had other people, using acid or whatnot to burn them off and get rid of them. And Robert's idea was to replace them, which he thought was, a smarter idea. But, when he got released, he went straight. He opened up a dive shop and went back to what he had been trained to do in the Navy and was a scuba diver and taught scuba diving lessons the rest of his adult life.
I guess if you're smart and you kind of get your head right when you're locked up, you start to realize that you can live on very little, like you really don't need, when I left the halfway house, and I stayed in the halfway house the whole time, didn't even try and go home, I'm staying here. Everybody complained, they take 20% of I'm like, listen, do the math. You can't live anywhere else this cheap. Right. I just sat there, did the numbers one time. I said, I'm staying here the whole time. Mm-hmm. And they're feeding me. So, stayed there the whole time, got out, went and rented a room from somebody, cheap, going cheap.
Yep.
I mean, I was so thrilled. I had this little thing, this little magic thing here that I could watch YouTube for free. I mean, there was so much stuff for free. And I could, all I have to do is kind of go back. And if somebody cuts me off in my car and for an instant, you get angry, and I think, I got time. It's fine.
Yeah. You sound a lot like Robert. Okay. Robert's like, I'm never locking a door again. You can't upset me. He was so funny. He was like, look, I got a jug of vodka over there. I've got a TV. I've got a car. I can go do whatever I want to do when I want to do it. He said, I'll never be behind a locked door again. Life is good.
Yeah. I say that all the time. I'm like, people don't realize how good it is out here. Right. They have no idea.
Right.
But, like I said, the recidivism is high, but that's because, I think a lot of guys get out and they do well for the guys that intend to. There are other guys that I know guys that were, as soon as they got out, they were ready to commit crime. That was just their life, I'm going to be in and out of prison, and, I'm going to try and stay out, but I'm not getting a job at Walmart. They're just I'm not doing it. So,
oh, sure.
So, but then there were other guys that I think they get out, and I think a couple of years go by and they get frustrated and they can't buy the things they want, and they lose sight of the fact of how horrible prison, is. Mm-hmm. And really, it's not horrible. It's just so isolating. You have so little, and you get out here and there's such an abundance of everything that you start to think you deserve everything. You start feeling entitled. You get frustrated, and their go-to move is crime.
Yes. Did you ever know Frank Collada from the Hole in the Wall gang? He was a mafia hitman.
That sounds really familiar.
He's depicted in the movie Casino.
No, but it's funny. I've interviewed a guy that knew the guys that were in the movie.
Okay.
Casino.
Well, Frank and I were, buddies too. And one time we were.
Are these guys that you've met because of your podcast?
No, these are people that I've met because of my job.
Oh, okay.
So I might be investigating a case or something, and I feel like you're going to have information that I need. And then they just turn out to be incredible people and are, interesting, and, they are who they are. Right. But I mean, everybody has more than one side to them. But anyway, we're at lunch one day and he looks at me and he says, hey, do you mind if I give your kids some advice? And I said, of course not, please. So he looks at my daughter who's 10 and he says, never trust a man ever. So I thought, that's pretty good. She's just, we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But, men can come at you with ulterior motives. So, between now and, 25, just keep that in mind. So then he looked right at my son and he said, and this goes to what you were talking about just a minute ago. He looks at him and he says, reading never got me paid. So my son, of course, took that to mean I'm never doing homework again. It's a waste of time. But what he was trying to say was the education piece was never going to garner him the money that crime would. And so to your point, when you're talking about somebody that gets released and they're frustrated, McDonald's is never going to give them the money that they want. That's never going to get you a Lamborghini. That's never going to get you a penthouse. It's never going to get you the Rolex. It's not.
Right.
And so your mindset has to change. And that's the biggest thing that I've seen. I mean, Robert, his mindset changed. His thing was, I can walk out of my backyard and nobody's going to tell me I can't go out there. I can get in a car and drive. So for him, that was worth millions.
Yeah.
You know, but the person that is still, you know, chasing that get rich quick, you know, you know.
Yeah. Oh, like I feel like, you know, although I work all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but, and that's what I feel like. I don't feel like it's working. Does that make sense? Like I'm not laying block. I'm not hanging drywall. I'm not on a roof. In Florida, I mean, you must be a sadist if you're going to be a roofer in Florida.
I hear you. Yep.
So, you know, I barely go outside during the day. I almost really never leave. I'm actually going to sell my car because I was talking to my wife and I was like, listen, I'm paying like $400 for the car payment, another $200 for insurance.
Mm-hmm.
This is ridiculous. I'm like, I never drive. She drives us to the gym in the morning and back.
Mm-hmm.
I said, if I had to go somewhere, it would be cheaper to Uber. I could Uber 8 times a month. I could leave my house twice to Tampa and back and still not pay $600.
Correct.
$500 or $600, whatever it comes to. So anyway, but yeah, I basically never leave the house. Like I do this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I write articles. I research articles, and you know, I paint. Like, think about what I do.
Yes.
I talk to people.
Yeah.
You know, I talk to people. I write stories, and you know, I paint. Like, honestly, it really, like, do you really have a job? I mean, I make my own schedule.
Right.
It's really like the idea that I was, and anybody who's ever watched my show has probably heard me say this 30 times. The fact that, you know, I have to every time I start to get cocky or arrogant, I kind of remind myself, like, bro, 5 years ago, you were laying in a bunk bed in prison thinking to yourself, how am I going to make a living? Like, I was telling myself, you're going to get a job at McDonald's and you're going to work your way to another job that you like, and maybe you'll sell used cars. You're going to live in someone's spare room and you're going to be happy. You're going to be thankful.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I would tell myself that. And so the idea that I'm making a living goofing off, my wife says, you live a cat's life. Like you take naps. Like you sit on the couch. And I'm like, hey, that's what you think I do during the day? She's like, I do.
That is awesome.
You know?
Yeah. But your story is inspired. And I think that's why it's so important. But it's the truth. If you think about 5 years ago, you're laying in that cot and people think, oh, when you get out, you're never going to be able to find anything. Your life's going to be crap. It's going to be whatever. And you have people telling you, why don't you try this? Why don't you go back? Why don't you pull off the perfect job? I mean, really? Thanks for the help, folks, because you're trying to get me pinched again. Like, why in the world? But what you're telling people is you don't have to have, you know, the corner office. You don't have to bust rocks. You don't have to be laying tar on a roof. Good God Almighty. I mean, I can't think of anything worse in Florida, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't. And I know, like, our dad, we would be driving and he would see somebody doing that type of job. And all he would say is, girls, do your homework.
Yeah.
I mean, that's hard work. And again, I think for people that are listening to you that are maybe going to get out in 6 months or a year, okay, there are things you can do. And I think that's important for people to hear. I do.
Yeah, you say the inspiration thing. I hear the inspiration all the time. I get emails from guys saying how inspirational my story is. I'm like, and I'm always like, I've never once tried to be inspirational. I interview guys that went to prison, got out of prison, and they'll sit here and they'll talk about, they'll preach it's so obvious that they're trying to be, well, now I it's all about the kids now. And it's like, and letting them know not to do this. And I'm like, all right, stop. I feel like it's disingenuous. It's like, stop.
That's why you work. You're not trying.
Yeah. I'm like, but I keep getting these guys that come, but I also get the guys that send me the emails that say, bro, like, I'll give you however much money you want if you'll just tell me how to do this, how to do that. Help me set it up. Help me do this. And I'm always like, are you serious? Like, you do understand that if you go out right now and just do anything, the feds are just going to add my name to the indictment. I mean, they're going to look at your phone. They're going to see that we've spoken 6 times on the phone. They're going to see that we had correspondence. They're going to, like, they don't even have to tell the jury. They can just say, oh, by the way, he was in communication with this guy. They're going to like add his name. Then even if I said, hey, you know what? I'm going to trial. Wow, what a mistake that is. I can't take the stand because they're going to be like, oh, you took by the way, jury, now that he's taken the stand, we're going to list all the things he's been convicted of. Don't convict me again, even if there's no new evidence.
Right.
And he was talking to this guy who got caught doing the same thing he was doing. They're gonna, the jury, even if I was on the jury, I'd be like, yeah, bro, I don't, hell of a coincidence. I'm like, don't talk to me about that. Like,
you sound like my husband. My husband laughs. I mean, I've got plenty of prosecutors and judges and special agents in my phone, but I also have the Frank Coladas of the world and Robert Shabline and Johnny Lee Cleary. And he says, what if something legitimately happens to you and they go through your phone and you've had contact with a hitman, you've had contact with this person in a hate group, you've had contact with this person, but again, as they say, game recognizes game. A con man is going to look at you and understand. A prosecutor is going to look at you and understand. So, part of me, again, you are inspirational, and I think your story is important, and it's important for both sides, because I have people that, sometimes give me a hard time, like, how can you possibly say this criminal is your friend? Because he was.
Right.
He was good to me. He was funny. He was engaging. He taught me a lot. I mean, that's a good friend. And yeah, he had a past, but, for the grace of God, right? Like, I started somewhat as a con artist. I'll tell you a story. You'll enjoy this. So I saw in a weekly reader where if you had chinchillas, you could make thousands of dollars. Okay. And that seemed like a get rich quick, which sounded good to me. I didn't want to work hard. I mean, I was, 6 or 7 years old. So I called the 1-800 number and I wanted to order the whole thing. Give me the chinchillas, the incubators, the lights. I need it all because I'm going to be super rich. So then they said, okay, what credit card? And I was like, well, I don't know anything about a credit card. And she goes, well, we can send it COD. And I said, well, what's that? And she goes, that's cash on delivery. Let's do that. So we're, it's 6 to 8 weeks. Well, when you're that little, that might as well be 2 years. I mean, I basically forgot about doing it. All of a sudden, there's a knock at our door one Saturday, and this person is delivering live animals. It's stamped on the crate. And my dad is like, what? And they're like, these are the chinchillas and the incubators and all the wires and the lights and the feed. And, you owe us whatever it was. I don't remember if it's $175 or what it was. But at the time, in 1970, it was a ton of money. And my dad's like, you can take these things right on back. I'm not paying you for this stuff. Well, I'm standing there. You're missing the opportunity of a lifetime. We're going to be rich, and of course he's cracking up, but he's also like, you cannot be ordering stuff, much less COD, and you probably were not going to make a dime. And, I was frustrated for a good couple of years because, okay, we're just going to stay broke. He would not get with the program. And I'm like, sir, come on.
Bent is the story of John J. Boziak's phenomenal life of crime. Inked from head to toe, with an addiction to strippers and fast Cadillacs, Boziak was not your typical computer geek. He was, however, one of the most cunning scammers, counterfeiters, identity thieves, and escape artists alive, and a major thorn in the side of the U.S. Secret Service as they fought a war on cybercrime. With a savant-like ability to circumvent banking security and stay one step ahead of law enforcement, Boziak made millions of dollars in the international cyber underworld, with the help of the Chinese and the Russians. Then, leaving nothing but a John Doe warrant and a cleaned-out bank account in his wake, he vanished. Boziak's stranger-than-fiction tale of ingenious scams and impossible escapes, of brazen run-ins with the law and secret desires to straighten out and settle down, makes his story a true crime con game that will keep you guessing. Bent: How a Homeless Teen Became One of the Cybercrime Industry's Most Prolific Counterfeiters. Available now on Amazon and Audible.
There's other things that I tried. I saw a truck and it said pine straw for sale. Our yard is eat up with pine straw. So if you're gonna buy it, right? And then I went to my neighbors who were elderly and I said, can I rake your yard? They're like, sure. And I'm like, suckers, because they don't realize people pay for this. Well, again, my dad had to explain, honey, you're not going to make any money. I mean, you can rake every yard in this community, So anyway, he's the reason I'm still broke. I mean, that's just it. So we all have a little con artist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think we all have good. We all have a little, maybe not so good, but people are mostly good.
So I don't know how we got on topic. So when did you start? Okay, when did you? We're 50 minits into this one.
Okay,
There's 25 on the other one. How did you start?
I always,
okay.
Again, I read everything I could, and when I was 18, the very first criminal justice gig, I guess, that I ever had, I was hired to be a store detective at a large department store called Rich's.
At 18?
Yeah, because they wouldn't suspect me. It was great. I had a great time, learned a ton. From there, I worked at the Grady Rick Crisis Center because they would actually allow me to volunteer there at 18, and I could actually interview victims. And I worked directly with a gentleman by the name of Detective Black. He was extraordinary to me. He taught me how to interview. He taught me how to write a report. And there were often times that I was able to get information from the victim that he was not able to. So that was just laying the groundwork for what was to come. And then as I worked through college, I had different internships. I had one with the FBI, one with the Secret Service. I just had a great time. And then my first real job was with the Crime Commission. And I just never looked back. And this year is my 40th year doing something in criminal justice.
Okay. Did you ever work for who do you work for now? You said you're currently...
I work for a Metropolitan Atlanta Police Department, and I'm their crime scene investigator.
Okay. How long do you work there?
I've been there 8 years this week, actually.
Okay. Do you ever work for the Sheriff's Department or?
I worked for the Fulton County Sheriff's Department for 8 years in special ops. I worked for the Crime Commission. I worked as a probation officer. I've done a lot of really interesting, I've had a really lucky career. When I was with the Crime Commission, I was assigned to the Major Case Division, and we had a prosecutor there that was just a spitfire. And the first time I ever met the prosecutor was about 2:45 in the morning at a crime scene, and this little sports car comes flying up, and this person jumps out, and they're like, "What do you got? What do you have? What can I do to help?" And I'm like, "What in the world is that?" I mean, I had never seen anything like it. I had never seen at that time a prosecutor outside the courthouse. They always stayed in the ivory tower, as it were.
Right.
And that prosecutor turned out to be Nancy Grace.
Oh my God.
So, you know, I've had a lot of luck. I mean, I was in charge of the Olympic crisis response team, which nobody would have ever cared anything about, except we had a bomb. And then that matriculated into training with the State Department. And I got to train every single Olympic crisis response team from then on. So, you know, luck is good.
So, Nancy Grace, I wrote a story about a guy named Frank Amadeo. Frank Amadeo is the short version is he's a rapid cycling bipolar with features of schizophrenia. He's a lawyer, and he was a tax attorney in Atlanta when Nancy Grace was the I guess the attorney, the state attorney, or she was just
assistant district attorney.
The district attorney. Okay.
Right.
And so he ended up having a bout of depression for like a couple of weeks, like 2-3 weeks, where like he couldn't get out of bed. And this would happen every few years to him.
Sure.
So he was basically the one running. He had 2 partners, but they were pretty much useless in this it was a tax attorney, kind of like H&R Block, but for bankruptcy.
Okay.
I keep saying tax for bankruptcy. Sorry, he wasn't a tax attorney. He was a bankruptcy attorney. Sorry. And they were kind of trying to do like a mill, right? They're just running them through. Well, anyway, he was the one who was basically doing most of the work. So when he disappears for 2 weeks, he was in the hospital for like a week. And then he wouldn't get out of bed at his house. So by the time he shows back up, everything's falling apart. Anyway, they ended up pilfering the account where people were paying money in to the account. And he says I don't know what's true and what's not true. He says his partners ended up taking the money. He ended up saying something like he ended up getting 30,000 of it, but didn't realize how they were paying him. I forget exactly what the story was. But in the end, the place closed. There were a lot of unresolved bankruptcies, and Nancy Grace came in and investigated the entire thing and tried to get Frank indicted. Tried to indict him, had held a couple of grand juries, but they wouldn't indict because I guess he wasn't really on the accounts, and even, so wasn't sure. So, but she was so upset about it, she went to the U.S. attorney and gave him all the information, and the U.S. attorney was able to indict him. And so anyway, that's kind of, that's my Nancy Grace story. I'm sure you have hundreds way better than that, but she actually made an attempt to indict this guy. And then when she was so frustrated and irritated that she couldn't indict him, she's like, oh, well, I got you. And she went and gave it because, the U.S. attorney, obviously the feds have a much more lenient ability on a lot of the federal laws.
I had never heard that story. I don't know him. It sounds sad all the way around. But I will tell you, she comes from a place, being a victim of crime, that if she sees victimization in any way, financial, physical, emotional, she doesn't tend to let loose of it. And I tell people a lot that if you had a child missing, would you want her on it?
Right.
And 100% of the time people say yes, if it's their child, because she's not going to turn loose. She's not going to stop arguing. She's not going to stop calling people out. And she's got such a heart. I mean, I know her. I just told you that's how we met. But I mean, we, have maintained our friendship. And I will tell you just one story. And I don't think she would care if I told this, but like back in the day, she took files home. So if you ever went to her house, she would have these files sometimes spread out. And we were there one night talking about a case, and she literally touched every single file and prayed over it. She prayed for the officer. She prayed for the judge. She prayed for the victim. She prayed for herself. Please let me do the right thing. Let everybody do the right thing, and let there be justice. And that's one of those things that if you only know the TV persona, you sometimes think, man, she's just, a bulldog. But then when you think about, she was so close to being married, and she was so happy, and she was so young, and she was innocent. I mean, you're talking about a girl from Macon, Georgia, that went to college at Valdosta State, that had her whole world not flipped upside down, but ripped apart, that instead of just going home and not being able to get out of the bed, decided, okay, my fiance was murdered, who was a baseball star, and I was going to be an English teacher. Well, now I'm going to go to law school, and I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to another person. So,
right. Well, everybody's hard on law enforcement,
Oh, sure.
until someone breaks in their house.
That's right.
Or they're attacked, or they need them, and then it's defund the police until my neighborhood is overridden with crime.
Yep.
And then it's where the police. It's like, okay, well, you were at that protest last month. What do you think they are?
Yeah.
So yeah. I can see her. I could see wanting that prosecutor after even Frank. I wrote a story on him, and we were incarcerated together. Mm-hmm. And he's like, she had two grand juries. Two.
Yeah.
She couldn't indict me. Two. And he was like, she just wouldn't let it go. It was like, well,
that's her.
You got indicted. He's like, I didn't even know. I didn't know anything about it. And
right.
But we're talking.
But you're in prison. Yeah.
Yeah. We're talking in prison.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, he's an interesting character. Yeah. You'd have a field day with him. He's actually incarcerated, and I wrote a story about him, by the way. It's insane. I actually wrote a book, but I wrote a synopsis and a book. I expanded the synopsis, once I got out of prison, but I wrote a synopsis in prison. It's probably 12 or 1,300 words, maybe 1,400 words. And it's on my website if you ever want to read it. And if you don't want to read it, I have an audio version. Anyway, since he was in his teens, he has believed that God is talking to him, and he is preordained to be emperor of the world. Now, remember, he's got features of schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. Goes to college, gets a degree, very smart.
Sure.
Gets a law degree, gets out, starts this bankruptcy thing, bankruptcy kind of firm that, and it ends up, failing after 5-6 years. He then becomes a venture capitalist. He then gets indicted. He goes to a camp for like a year, gets out. He then gets out of that, becomes a venture capitalist, puts together a massive company, starts raising money for his company, which is ultimately going to basically, it's like Spectre. He is expecting it to economically dominate the U.S. and then spread throughout all continents. And he also has a military wing. Like, he's got his own private military. They've got contracts in Afghanistan. It's a massive operation. I've got pictures of him with Bush at the White House, and I don't mean like a photo op. I mean like they're sitting in the Roosevelt room, like like with a group of people. He would help sponsor a NATO summit. It's just a massive undertaking, this company. Ultimately, he's doing most of this, by the way, by embezzling money, by not paying federal income taxes, employment taxes, to the tune of $200 million.
Wow.
Eventually, the whole thing, the feds come in.
Wow.
The whole conspiracy behind it. He gets indicted. He goes to prison for 22 years. That's where I met him. So he's a fascinating guy. But
200 million.
Yeah, it's listen, and if you read the story, it's insane. Like, the things he was telling me, and then of course I would order the Freedom of Information Act, and I'd order the transcripts, and I'd get the transcripts and the Freedom of Information Act, and you've got FBI reports where they're talking about how he's trying to buy airplane. He's trying to buy he's F-16s and F-15s. He's negotiating contracts to buy these used, they gut them. They take all the electronics out. You can still buy the planes. He's talking about putting them in Cyprus. He wants to buy, 25 of them. He backed a coup in the Congo. There's a documentary about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's fascinating. But so back to you. Can I ask you, do you have any cold cases that are interesting to you that you could talk about?
Absolutely. I think one that I will talk about right now is Melissa Wolfenberger. And the reason I'll talk to you about her is because we've been having a theme this whole conversation, but Melissa went missing and she was married, and her mother could not get any police department to take a missing persons report because she's married, she's grown, and if she doesn't want to have contact with you, she doesn't have to have contact with you. And if she wants to disappear or run away, that's not illegal. But her mom kept saying something's not right. She wouldn't have just left her children. She wouldn't, stop having contact with me. Like, even if she wanted to leave her husband, that's one thing, but she wouldn't abandon her family. So this goes on a while, and finally she badgers her own police department enough where finally a detective says, fine, I will take a report that she's missing, but I can't investigate it. She didn't live in our jurisdiction. There's no sign of a crime at all, but I will take it for paper trail. Well, she went to Atlanta police and then said the same thing. She's missing. And Atlanta said, okay, since they've taken a police report that she's missing, we'll do the same thing, but that's as far as we can go. We've been by the house. There's no sign of anything. They've moved away is what it looks like. Fast forward, a driver delivering for UPS sees a ripped garbage bag and a skull in the middle of the street. He stops. The skull is misidentified as a Caucasian male. So it sits on a shelf because it's not pertaining to Melissa.
Right.
Fast forward again, months later, that was April, the skull was found. In June, 4 more trash bags were found, each containing an arm or a leg. Some dental records were done, comes back to be Melissa. Now, this has been going on for years and years. The person that has been helping me understand the crime, understand the players, understand what law enforcement could and could not do, and most importantly, understand possibly the number one suspect is her father. Her father.
I thought you were going to say her husband.
No, he's probably on the suspect list, but the person that's helping me understand everything, who's literally helping me on the case, is her father, who is the Flint River killer. So we've been communicating via letter because he's in prison. So again, it's one of those things, who understands a killer better than another killer? Who understands these principal players better than him? Who understands who's probably got a beef with him, who wanted retribution, or who had a background that was indicative of somebody that might at one point snap possibly. So again, everybody has a gift. Your story is helping people. Hopefully my background can help people. Nancy Grace's background is helping people. Well, the Flint River killer, his background prayerfully is helping people, and in this particular instant, his own daughter.
Wow, how insane is that his own daughter ends up getting murdered?
Listen, Matt, it's the only case in history that I can find where a serial killer becomes a true victim of crime, meaning somebody in his immediate family is murdered.
Right.
And then he reaches out to law enforcement for help, because the detective that originally arrested him for his murders, he asked when she was still missing, can you find her? He said, you caught me after 25 years. Can you find my daughter? So it's an incredible story. And it's one of those that I think will be, in my career, it's going to be the only one like it. It's the only one in history like it. But again, sometimes people in prison have the information you need.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what a great, if there was an actual, a resolution, that would be just, what a phenomenally unique
Yep.
story, bizarre, but just
Bizarre.
right. Like you can't make it. That's the great thing about true crime. Like, how many times I've been writing someone's story or interviewing them, and you just look up and you go, what?
Exactly.
Like, you couldn't even come up with it. Like, this sounds so insane that it's almost fake. Like, it's almost
absolutely.
Like that happened.
Yeah. If I sat down and was watching some show and this was the premise, I'd be like, come on. Never going to happen. Never going to happen. Like with Robert Shablan, I was the only person in law enforcement he would fool with. When he would even go back to Alcatraz, he didn't want to shake hands with the old guards. He would openly tell you, I don't have any use for anybody in law enforcement. We are not friends. I mean, it was literally an us versus them in his life. So I get that. But when you've got somebody that they chose the path they chose for whatever reason. But now, just like Nancy Grace, Nancy was on one path and it got flipped. Carl was on one path and it got flipped. So at this point, you need the help of the very people you can't stand.
Mm-hmm.
It's all good. And then maybe, prayerfully, we can see each other a little different.
It's funny. I was going to say how small the world is and how, I wrote a story about a guy whose best friend had overdosed. Like everybody thought it was an overdose, but everybody didn't think it was the police said it was an overdose. He and everybody else was like, it's not an overdose. This doesn't make sense. Like, they're like, oh, well, then he killed himself. They're like, he didn't kill himself. Like, and then a year or two later, the guy I wrote the story about, his name's Joseph Vitale. He gets arrested, and he's in the U.S. Marshals holdover, waiting to be sentenced. And he befriends, or a guy kind of starts talking to him, befriends him. And that guy ends up, he's like, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a stockbroker. I raise venture capital and do this. No, okay. They have a little conversation. He's like, oh, I knew a stockbroker. Oh, you did? He's like, oh, yeah. Yeah, and he starts telling him about how they kind of befriended him and we're hanging out and we're partying and doing drugs, because a lot of people, this is in Palm Beach. Palm Beach is notorious for all these. Half the guys in Palm Beach are con artists. So he's down there, and they're in that industry, a lot of drugs, a lot of So the guy ends up talking about him. He said, and I start to realize that he's talking about my buddy. And he so I kind of keep saying, oh yeah, oh, do you know so and so? Oh yeah. So we have a whole conversation. The guy ends up telling him, yeah, that guy owed this girl that I used to mess with a lot of money. He said, I ended up having to do him in. And he's like, really? Like, he doesn't know he knows him. Sure. He never said, I know that guy.
Wow.
He ends up saying that he goes, how did you do it? He said, I gave him a hot shot. And he was like, when he told him, he said, I didn't know what that was. He's like, a hot shot. He's like, yeah, I such and such, and I did this. He's like, then we went through the house, we got like 30 grand. Now keep in mind too, his girlfriend, or his fiance, when they found the body, she of course immediately said, you understand, he was murdered. The house was robbed. We're missing 30,000 in cash. We're missing, and she listed all of these items.
Wow.
And the problem is he was doing drugs. He did die of a drug overdose. So the police looked at it twice, and they said, look, I get it, but the guy's not talking. By the way, he was back in for robbing banks. He'd gotten out of prison, got out of prison in the halfway house, started robbing banks, got picked up again. In the meantime, he kills this guy, gets picked up again, and he's waiting sentencing with happens to be the guy's best friend or good friend, if you can have a best friend when you're in your 30s. Yeah. So, I mean, what a small, that's one of those things that you couldn't.
That's right.
Those coincidences that happen, you go, how?
That's right.
How odd is that? What a small world.
It is a small world.
And
Yeah.
the guy would say something. Of course, he's saying something because he's thinking, what are the chances of this guy?
Yeah.
He's nobody. He's just some guy in prison. We're both waiting. Like, he doesn't know
Yeah.
enough. He said, but I did know. I knew all the people that he knew. I knew who it was. He has even mentioned the name of his subdivision. Specifically told him the name of the subdivision. I mean, like, he was naming off all of these things. Anyway.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's an odd world. But yeah, I love true crime. It's those types of things that you go, that's bizarre. There's so many bizarre things. Boy, that story, that's amazing. That's got to be a resolution. You need to figure that one out.
We're hoping. I'll text you when I have an update.
All right.
For sure.
And you have a podcast, right?
I do. It's called Zone 7.
What do you talk about on the podcast?
Cold cases that we've worked. And Zone 7 came about because in the Atlanta Police Department, there's 6 police zones. So back in the day before cell phones, if we wanted to all meet afterwards, you just couldn't go over the radio and say, hey, everybody, we're going to meet at the bar tonight. So we would say, let's 5-9 at Zone 7 after shift. So that way it would be acceptable. And then Zone 7 kind of became this group of people that you trust, that have your back, that are not going to, do harm to you by talking about you or setting you up or any of that kind of stuff. The people you can literally go to, not unlike a criminal organization. You want those people that are going to tell you the truth, that are going to protect you, that are going to, not talk crap about you when you're not in the room. The people that only want to help you, whether it's on a case or, further your career or whatever. So your Zone 7 is, pretty small, but it's a powerful group. So that's why I call it Zone 7, because the people that I have as my guests are people that are in my Zone 7.
Okay. So how many people are you the host, or there's other people involved?
I'm the host, and I bring people in because they have something to do with the case we're talking about. They either have an expertise in whatever it is, or they helped me, or we searched the scene together. There's some reason they're there, and that'll come out during the, interview.
Okay. How often do you post? Like, how long have you been doing it?
I've only been doing it 6 months yesterday, and I post on Wednesdays once a week.
Okay. And is it on YouTube?
No. It's just, iHeart and Spotify, that sort of thing.
You got to put it on YouTube. You got to get the StreamYard thing.
I got to learn how to do that.
I figured it out. I couldn't
Okay.
use a cell phone when I got out.
Clear.
I mean,
Clear. Roger that.
There was no iPhone. There were no iPhones when I went into prison. There was no YouTube. When I went into prison, YouTube had been out for like a year. I'd never been on it that I know of, that I could recall. Facebook had been out for like a year. I was on the run, and I remember my girlfriend said, hey, do you want to get a Facebook page? There's this thing, Facebook. People are moving from MySpace to Facebook. And I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm wanted. Probably not a good idea. I don't know. Feel bad. I'm not an expert on being wanted, but feels like a bad idea. And
it does feel like a bad idea.
Yeah. And I'm not an expert, but so, and then YouTube had, like, it had just come out. Like, you weren't readily watching it. People weren't seeing, like, I don't ever recall knowing what it was, but I do know when I looked back on it, like, oh no, it was out, but I don't ever recall hearing about it till I was years into prison. And then podcast wasn't a thing, because that's a new word that wasn't even invented until like 2008 or 9 or 10 or something.
Right.
It wasn't even, it's like they put two words together. And then I would meet guys. iPhones didn't come out till like 2009. So I was already locked up like 3 years. I remember there was a guy one time telling me because he was there for like almost like $500,000 to $1 million in iPhone crimes. He would get a corporation, have people go in and get corporate accounts. Like, they'd give them like 9 iPhones on corporate accounts. They didn't have to have they didn't run the credit, nothing, which is a corporation. And so they get the phone, didn't go on their credit or anything. So they give them the phone for nothing. So they get like 9, and he'd have send people in over and over, and then he'd sell he'd pull out the SIM cards or whatever, and then he'd sell the phones. overseas. They'd give him like $400 for like $1,000 or $500 for $1,000. So he did this to the tune of like 500,000 or 600,000 or something. And so he was trying to explain it to me, and I was like, right. He's like, you know how he kept saying, well, you know how on the iPhone this, you know how on the iPhone, I said, and after about 5 minutes ago, I said, listen, your crime didn't exist when I got locked up.
Wow.
Like, I'd been locked up at that point, like 10 years.
Yes.
And he was like, oh, wow, bro, how long you been in here? It was like, of course, he's a kid. He's like in his late 20s. So he's like, haven't they always existed? I'm like, no.
Yeah, so, that's crazy.
But yeah, it's, yeah. So yeah, so if I can figure out how phones work and iPhones and YouTube and all that, like, come on.
Roger that.
You really have. Like,
I'm on it today.
That's a great, I love the guys who are like, well, I'm not really a techie person. Stop it. Stop.
I'm doing it today. I will start learning.
Yeah, I was amazed. YouTube, you can look anything up. I can say anything to YouTube.
Yes.
And if somebody's made a video, there's 1,500 videos on anything that I ask it.
Yep.
I learned how to edit and do everything on YouTube.
No, you're right.
I didn't read a manual. I just said, Final Cut Pro, how do you stack videos? And there's like 1,500 of them.
Yes.
I'm like, wow.
Yes.
Well, all right. I know you spent way more time than you expected to spend.
I've enjoyed every second of it, Matt. Right. Absolutely. And listen, when you come to Atlanta next week, call me. I would love for you to come by, and I'll show you the police station, give you a ride. We'll have some fun. What's
funny, I'm be nice to ride in the front of the police car.
Absolutely.
So, what's funny is, like, when you first said Atlanta, my first thought was I stole $400,000 in Atlanta. That was the first place when the FBI showed up at my office. The first place I went to in Alpharetta, Georgia. Alpharetta. I rented somebody's house that was worth about $200,000. I went down to Fulton County, satisfied the 2 loans he had on his house, made a fake ID in his name. Name was Michael Shanahan. And then I called 3 hard money lenders, 3 or 4. I think it was 3. 3 hard money lenders, had them come out to the house, borrowed all 3 mortgages at the same time, and borrowed like roughly $400,000, deposited the money into a bunch of banks, pulled the money out in cash, and then took off. And then the Secret Service showed up, a few months, maybe a month or so later. And yeah. Gail, do you remember Gail? Well, she was a U.S. attorney, Gail McKenzie.
I don't know Gail.
No, yeah, she was a U.S. attorney, she was a U.S. attorney, but the Secret Service, the officer on my case was Andrea Peacock.
I know Andrea Peacock.
She was very nice.
Oh yeah, she's very nice. She used to be with the Cobb County DA's office when I was there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was interviewed by American Greed when they did an episode.
Yeah.
Very polite.
Oh yeah, she's nice. She's polite.
Everybody's always talks about the FBI. I was like, the FBI, they were all mean. They were all kind of no, not really. There was this one FBI. She was very nice too. But yeah, but the Secret Service, they were very polite, very professional. Not mean spirited. I've met some mean spirited people.
Yeah, my involvement with the Secret Service has always been the same. Very professional, very nice. They understand exactly what they're there to do, and it's all good. There's no arrogance. I've worked with other agencies, they can be a little.
I know.
I hear you. Because even in my world, I'm not a Fed. Yeah, well, just saying, because you're not a Fed, sometimes you're treated differently because you're a little, bitty city. But, whatever we're doing still got you here. So you're welcome. But I appreciate this. This has been fabulous. Wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I think I'm going to Atlanta again in August also because there's a cyber crime convention there.
Okay.
And they're going to have a bunch of people, and so I'm supposed to go to that too. Yeah. So
excellent. Well, I'm right here if you need something. Again, I would love for you to come by and let's hang out.
I appreciate you guys watching. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified of videos just like this. Check out the description box for Zone 7. Matt goes over cold cases with other detectives, and I really appreciate you guys watching. Leave me a comment in the comment section, and thanks for checking out the podcast. See you.